Hey, you awesome folks! Thanks for taking this journey of discovery with your guide, Keith Haney. You're listening to the Becoming Bridge Builders podcast, your favorite podcast for everything from racial reconciliation to education innovation, justice reform, and leading change in the 21st century. This podcast is for people who love to be challenged with difficult topics, but want practical solutions to solve these challenging issues. Becoming Bridge Builders makes change possible. Each week on the podcast, Keith invites innovative thought leaders to share how they are building bridges in their area of expertise. You will hear breakthrough ideas and concepts that are changing the world. He's featuring guests who are best-selling authors, leaders at Microsoft, entrepreneurs, leading educators, professors, lawyers, and so many more. Listen in to learn how you can be the bridge to the change you are seeking.
My guest today is Paula Lehman Ewing. She's an award-winning journalist, social documentarian, and author specializing in criminal justice and social equity. Her debut book, Reimagining, the Revolution, 4 Stories of Abolition, Autonomy, and Forging New Paths in a Modern Civil Rights Movement, amplifies the voices of incarcerated individuals and advocates for social justice. We welcome her to the podcast. Well, Paula, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
It's good to have you on. Looking forward to this conversation. I've covered this topic on so many different ways before and haven't really delved into the particular part that you bring to this conversation. So it's going to be an exciting opportunity to talk about one other aspect of how we deal with things that are going on in our country and our world. So looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, I am too. I have listened to some of the other guests on this topic, so hoping to add something new.
I think you will.
Okay.
But before we get started, let me ask you my favorite question for my guests. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Well, I mean, I grew up with a Jewish mother, so I'm chock full of unsolicited advice. But I would say my is to remain teachable. My grandmother, Audrey, she passed away last year, and she was 96, and every summer she would go to college, to a seniors program to learn. And I thought that in a day and age where we have all the answers at our fingertips, perhaps we have gotten a little cocky in terms of what we think we know. And I have found to have much more profound conversations with people of all sorts of backgrounds by asking questions and remaining curious and remaining teachable, remembering that maybe I don't have the answers to everything.
I love that. You kind of mentioned your grandmother. Are there other people in your life who served as an inspiration for you or even a mentor on your journey?
Yeah, especially with my book, Reimagining the Revolution, a huge mentor and inspiration for me is Ken Oliver. He's mentioned in the book several times. I worked with him in a grassroots organization called All of Us or None. He still does work in fair chance employment, and he still does work to sort of help with justice causes. But he was incarcerated for almost 30 years. He spent 8 of it in solitary confinement, and he never gave up. He educated himself. He's one of the smartest people I've ever met. He's educated me. He's always been really tolerant of my, naivete. He's always pointing me to certain writers. But, he's the reason why, Frantz Fanon is in the book and not just kind of the more modern thought leaders.
I love that. So give us a brief overview of your book and tell us what inspired you to write it.
Sure. So the book is about organizations and individuals strategizing to exact change in radical new ways. So people that have looked at the protests on the street and say, this hasn't got this has looked pretty much the same for 60 years and it hasn't gotten us to where we need to be. Let's get off the street, let's strategize and come up with something new. And So the book is about my interactions with people in the organizations, about their ideas. And, I think it came from a couple places. I was a criminal justice reporter, and it's not unheard of for someone who looks at the system of mass incarceration in the face to uh, have a difficult time remaining objective about it. Chris Geidner was a BuzzFeed News editor. He's the legal editor for BuzzFeed News, and he left to pursue a nonprofit working on reform measures in criminal justice. Scott Budnick did the Hangover movies. He started volunteering in prison, left the movie business for a couple of years, and then the next time we saw him, he did Just Mercy, which is not funny, as not like the Hangover movies. And that's what happened to me. I was a criminal justice reporter, and I decided to get more involved. And once I did, I was sitting at a protest in 2020 with Ken, and we were looking at kind of the same stuff that people had been protesting a few years before, and then a few years before that. Um, and uh, and Ken was like, "This isn't going to do it." And I thought that was really. I was like, "Well, what if there's something else out there?" And so that's again where the teachable stuff came in, and I decided to look for people being who are trying to get change exacted in a new way.
One term you mentioned in your book, I don't think people think a lot about, is the industrial prison complex. Can you define that for people who may not be familiar with that concept?
Sure. So the prison industrial complex is a large network of surveillance and economic systems that interweave to control certain elements of society. So if you have a surplus population or workforce, the prison industrial complex will use things like electronic monitoring to make sure that anyone who's already done their time is still under surveillance after they leave, thus extending the power of the prison and control of the prison over that person. Um, it also takes the form of prison labor. One of the things that we're looking at right now is incarcerated firefighters who are in Los Angeles trying to fight those fires. They're able to do that because the state pays them $1 versus their counterparts in the firefighting field who make well above that. And so that's sort of how the prison industrial complex works. It then makes the state kind of dependent on those firefighters, thereby creating a reason to keep people in prison and to continue expand the budget and control of prison departments, which are largely unregulated and tend to just kind of operate under their own set of guidance.
Wow. I grew up in Louisiana, so one of our worst prison abuse systems was Angola. And
Yeah.
you had people working in the fields in Louisiana from the prison complex doing something you just described for basically pennies on the dollar.
Yeah, Angola, I write about Angola in the book because I mean, when people talk about slavery not being a thing, and then you look at Angola prisoners harvesting the same fields and that used to be plantations as people who were kind of captured under Fugitive Slave Act or kind of the convict leasing laws that came out. Like you could be, after slavery was abolished, you could be convicted for vagrancy, and then they could put you back to work. So Angola, I think, is one of the starkest contracts, one of the starkest reminders that it's still a problem.
Yeah, most definitely.
Mhm.
So you write about some important people in your work, and one of them I want to kind of talk about is Even Kilgore. Tell us a little bit about his story and why he's so prominent in your book.
Everyone loves Ivan. Um, so when I started writing the book, I checked in with Glenn Martin, uh, who is formerly incarcerated. And he founded Just Leadership, and he's been involved in a number of things. He has a great saying that the people who are closest to the problem are farthest from the solution. And he said, if you're going to write a book about oppression, the people who you should highlight uh, should be at the closest to the oppressor. And I know a guy. And so I was introduced to Ivan. I had heard of him. The organization I worked for wrote an amicus brief for Ivan because he had the prison was trying to transfer him. He had recorded COVID protocols being broken inside prison. This was like right before they became epicenters for COVID outbreaks, and the prison department didn't like the PR that got, and so they were doing things to try to get Ivan in physical danger. So I had heard of him. Um, Glenn told me about his organization, United Black Family Scholarship Foundation, and I found it really interesting. And that it was, I think ideas coming out of prison, they are able to, and I kind of talk about this in the chapter about with Hashima Denham, who's also incarcerated. They have this sort of view of society that's frozen. We're all out here, putting out the next media craze, whatever is like the crisis of the week. And they sort of have this idea of a society that they're able to visualize, and then use their experience to come up with something different. And because everything's been stripped away with them, they can start from nothing. They can start from zero, which I think is kind of an underlying theme of the book. The idea that abolition means come up with something that hasn't been thought of before, come up with something that uses different vocabulary, that uses different tools, that uses different resources. And so that's where Ivan's idea came from. He couldn't get work after he was released from prison in Oklahoma. He was forced back into the underground economy, and he knew one way to make the money that he needed, and that led him to the same sort of outcome as many people who fall into that trap and end up back incarcerated. So he said, okay, well then what could have been done differently for me? Because and he decided that it was, he would have been more invested in his community if people had made him feel like he was a part of that community. Ivan came out and he worked on the revitalization, which ended up being the gentrification of downtown Oakland. And then they priced the units so that he couldn't live there. But maybe if he lived there, he would have been, more cognizant of his neighbors. He would have been more invested in seeing it succeed. And so he's developing an organization that does that trains community members so that they have a way of being economically independent. And then they revitalize their own neighborhoods where they're going to live so that everyone has a stake in that community.
I know in the church we love change. I'm sure most organizations do. But because we are so resistant to change, how do we tackle something as big as the prison industrial complex? Because let's face it, in order for it to succeed, people are making money off of it. So how do you begin to reform a system that has no desire to reform?
Well, so I think you take reform off the table. I don't think that reform prison started as a reform.
Right.
It started as a reform to capital punishment. And then convict leasing was a reform to slavery. And then Jim Crow was a reform to, like the Confederacy. And so you have these things that are reforms that have allowed the prison industrial complex to evolve rather than dissolve. And so I think you need to start from scratch. Now, I don't think that it's safe for anyone to say, okay, just let everyone out of prison tomorrow. That's not safe for communities. That's not safe for the people in prison who have not been given any road to to release. Um, but you have to start thinking about what justice will look like without those sort of norms. If you're talking about people in church and they talk about change, they also talk about forgiveness. They also talk about um, this idea that this idea of like justice. And I don't think that people are finding justice in incarceration anymore. There seems to be, with DNA evidence and wrongful convictions and the things that we're learning about the human mind, not being fully developed until they're 25. It seems to be kind of a catch-all for society's ills, and it doesn't seem to be fixing anything. So I think the first step is to think beyond how can we make prison better and sort of think about how can we serve justice without it.
I remember when I was working on my research, I ran across the idea of restorative justice and
Mhm.
how it was being applied. I believe it was in Australia or it was in New Zealand actually. And I remember one of the drawbacks for that was the judges didn't want to do it because it took too much time and too much effort.
Mhm.
So it kind of fell apart because like, well, that's just too hard. Let's just do the prison system because that's easier for us to kind of manage. So if we did tear this down, like you talk about, do you have some thoughts of what that new system might look like?
So restorative justice is really interesting because saying like it's easier to just throw people in prison, restorative justice is actually a more satisfying experience for victims of crime. And if that's who we're trying to seek justice for, right? We're not just trying to like punish people because we think they're bad. We're trying, like, people are complicated. I've made mistakes. Everyone's made mistakes. That's what makes us people. And so restorative justice is actually geared toward the victim who finds more satisfaction than they do in traditional court. I think that I like the ideas of uh, putting. I think there's some good out there. I think that that it needs to be handled on a lot of levels. It needs to be handled, there's a school to prison pipeline. So like as young as school age children, we have kind of militarized security in prison, I mean in school, that sort of makes kids feel like they're criminals anyway. So like why not if that's what society expects of them? Um, so it has sort of that element to it. And then you have the element of, okay, well, if you have like the idea of amends. So if you have done a wrong, how are you going to right that wrong to that person? So, Hashima gives a great example of this in his chapter where, if is someone has killed the head of a family, right? Let's take worst case scenario, that them going to prison and you garnishing their prison wages to help support that family is not helping that family. So maybe justice in that situation looks like that person working, that person being isolated in a separate community until reparations are made to the family that's been harmed. Maybe it looks like a restorative justice conversation where you can't be held accountable without an account of what you did. So if a family comes in and tells you like this is who you took away, that's accountability. That's taking into account the entire situation. And so I think something like that is a lot more effective for exacting justice and keeping communities whole.
I like some of the things that the reformers you've mentioned in your book came up with. You want to share some of the things you discovered from your research of working with people who were incarcerated?
Yeah. Well, so first, there are two kind of categories of incarcerated people in my in my book. There are the activists, Ivan Kilgore, who you mentioned, Hashima Denham. They're both incarcerated in California. They've both come up with these amazing ideas. Ivan's organization is the Rebuild. Well, the element that I focus on is the Rebuild program, which like I said, trains community members to make livable wages and then restore their own communities and then have an investment in maintaining the integrity of those communities. Hashima is the Autonomous Infrastructure Mission, and he basically has designed communities independent of the state. So they have closed circuit economics, they grow their own food, they have their own security system, they have their own education system, and they've actually put a lot of those into place. And it's in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's working quite well. And then there are the incarcerated artists. So each chapter is introduced by a piece of art that was drawn by someone during their incarceration. One of the artists is still incarcerated. And I think like one of the great things about it is that they're so much more forgiving than we are. Like society has said, I want nothing to do with you, go live in a cage. And they are all, whether they're artists that create these beautiful drawings or amid a place with no beauty and no joy, or they're an activist who are reaching back to better a society that they might not even ever get to be part of again. That was really powerful for me as an experience.
So I just had a guest on my show, and he wrote a book too about the situation of, I think his book is about leveling the playing field was never level. It was kind of his thought. And we focused on, in that podcast, and this will probably go back to back with that because it's a really interesting conversation. We focused on the fact that education and social justice and housing are all kind of part of a bigger problem. And if you don't solve all three of those pieces, you end up creating a pipeline to the prison complex. So if you just fix education, but you don't fix the housing disparities, you're not going to have the income to be able to pour into education. As you look at just this part of it, this prison section of it, how does that influence and really kind of trap communities into a cycle of just repeating the same problems over and over again, or just recycling more and more people for this industrial prison complex?
Right. So there's no, well, I kind of touched on it earlier, like there is no rehabilitation element in prison anymore. In fact, Justice Clarence Thomas wrote an opinion that said the states have decided this isn't about rehabilitation anymore. It's simply about punishment. And so when you do that and you take someone who is then released but still on electronic monitoring, or they can't get a job because of their felony conviction, or they can't live with their family because Section 8 housing doesn't allow for someone with a conviction history. You don't let them vote because of felony disenfranchisement laws. Those things emit signals that you're not going to be able to come back here. You're not part of the society. You made that mistake, and we're going to judge you by your worst day. And that's the end. So if that's as best as it's going to get, like what kind of motivation does that person have to, if you keep telling them you're never going to be anything more than a criminal, why would they try?
Right.
And so I think that, a lot of this has to do with, I think it has to do with non-binary thinking is like it's my one takeaway. If you read the book and you only take one thing away, it's to think beyond conservative and liberal, to think beyond good and bad, to think beyond, like prison and then just letting everyone anarchy. So people are complex. And so society is complex. So you can't take a system like a political system that is binary, and at least in this country, and say, all right, well, let's have politics fix society. You don't need a political solution to societal problems. You need a social solution. So, that's what I would take away. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
No, it did. It was good.
Okay.
You also mentioned in your book a grassroots organization called Critical Resistance. Tell us a little bit about what that is hoping to accomplish with the work it's doing.
Right. So critical resistance is one of the, I call it the OG grassroots organizations that are still out there. It was founded by Angela Davis, Rose Baez, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, all people who have been fighting since the 60s. And it came out of this conference that happened in the early 2000s to address this dramatic increase in the prison population. I think it was at that time 500% increase. And this massive building that had gone on in California to create, I think it's something like 34 prisons. And they target specifically the prison industrial complex. So, Ivan kind of focuses on communities and stopping that revolving door. Critical resistance looks at shipping power away from the prison industrial complex and putting it into communities. So if you have, taxpayers are paying for empty beds in California prisons right now because they've emptied a lot of those places, but the prisons still want their money, and so they still want that budget. And so, when they talk about, well, I'm not going to pay for like a criminal to get an education, well, you're just paying for him to sit there. So, like, might as well have him do something to better himself so that when he's your neighbor, eventually, like 80% of people in prison are going to be released. So, I mean, there's those sort of education programs. And so that's what Critical Resistance is working on. I talk about their initiative to close 10 prisons in California. They're halfway there, which is very admirable. And with those funds, kind of creating things that you mentioned, putting it into public education, putting it into healthcare, putting it into things that better communities and that don't break them apart. I mean, one of the things that they promised during the building boom of prisons is that they would bring economics to these small towns. And what they did is no business wants to go there because there's a prison in the background. So the towns never got the income. And so that's what they're doing. They're looking at the real needs of the communities, and they're figuring out how the resources that are being poured into empty beds and essentially just human cages can be used to better communities.
Tell us about Greenwood.
So Greenwood is my tricky chapter. Greenwood is a bank. It is based out of Atlanta, Georgia, and it has a very unique cast of founders. Ryan Glover is the kind of serial entrepreneur that spearheaded it. And then the other two founders are Killer Mike, Mike Render, who is a part of Run the Jewels rap duo. He also has an amazing solo career at this point. And Andrew Young, Ambassador Andrew Young, who was a close confidant of Martin Luther King, and he orchestrated the Birmingham March. So I became interested because why wouldn't you? It's like the start of a joke, right? Like a civil rights activist, an entrepreneur and a rapper walk into a bank. Like what?
Right.
So that's like immediate. Yeah. So I looked at what they were doing, and essentially what they're doing is they're creating what they call compassionate capitalism. And it is a bank that is for communities of color, specifically Black and Latino. And they invest, they build that power of capital in order to exact change in society. Now, the reason why it's a difficult chapter is because true abolitionists, including Angela Davis, who is literally the chapter before, think that capitalism will always perpetuate racism, human exploitation, like you name it. Like capitalism has not has historically not worked out for people of color. Um, and I totally understand that argument. I think the reason why I still included them in the book is twofold. One, Bobby Seale, who is one of the co-founders of the Black Panther Party, he said if you're going to fight systems in this country, that I'm paraphrasing obviously, with you know, if you're going to get economic and political gains in this country, you're going to need capital. And that's coming from, a very radicalized group that Angela Davis was closely tied to. And I also think that their form of capitalism, just I don't think it's not a capitalism I've ever seen. I've never seen a capitalism that like cares about people. They get every month they give out a grant to a, a business, a startup. They do financial literacy classes. They've partnered with various organizations that, you can round up when you do a deposit, and then that round up will go towards giving meals for the community. And so they're doing it in a way that, like, yes, it's a bank. Yes, it's churning out capital, but to me, it doesn't look like capitalism.
I can understand how that would give you some interesting challenges.
Yeah.
Your book is well researched, and I'm always curious when you do a book with so much research. What were some surprising revelations that came out of your research?
It's a good question. I think, and it seems so obvious now, uh, but that we have locked up so many people, that there are such smart and talented people in prison. I sort of like, yes, I think my training as a recovering journalist, sort of like I read a lot of books, and I came across a bunch of data, and I wrote it all down. And but what I found was, the teachings of like George Jackson was what came out of prison. And it's become this sort of makeshift educational system for people who become resilient and become self-taught and become open-minded. Glenn Martin, who I mentioned before, is a great quote in the book where he says, like, I don't think Black and brown people like asked to go to prison to become resilient, but that's what's happened. So it's just like, so it's not great, but yeah, I think the fact that they have that wisdom, that they have that moment of pause that some of us only had in 2020, like this, when I decided to write the book, and when I had that moment of pause to think, hey, maybe we could do something differently. They unfortunately have a big moment of pause to come up with these really incredible ideas. And so I have found some of the teachings coming out of prison, and the writings and the artwork to be profound and quite humbling, because they're very talented.
So for people listening to our conversation going, yeah, I think something needs to happen. What is your book's call to action for the normal everyday citizen who goes, yeah, something's wrong, we need to do something about it?
So, two things. One I mentioned before is non-binary thinking. So challenge yourself when you hear there are only two options to think of a third. Um, and some people say, like, oh, well, that you're talking about like a third party candidate. I am not talking about a third party candidate. I'm talking about refusing to look for societal for solutions to societal problems in a political. Stop looking for political solutions. Look to social movements. You can, if one of the groups in the book speak to you, seek them out. They're always looking for volunteers. um, or come up with, with there are people who have been trudging this path for a really long time, kind of check in with them, remain teachable, and just sort of start having conversations about how we can, what does justice really look like? Come up with your own definitions of what justice look like. To me, it doesn't look like prison anymore. To me, safety doesn't look like calling the cops anymore. So come up with those definitions, find people who are already kind of trudging that path, and then use whatever tools you have to help them trudge. My tool is amplification and writing. I can tell a story. I decided I want to be a writer in fourth grade. So my fourth grade teacher told my parents, like, I'm so sorry, she's not going to be a consultant. Like, she wants to be a writer. And so like that's what I can do. I can tell stories, I can amplify people's voices. You know, Ivan has 4 books of his own, but you heard about him in mine because I have that kind of access. So I'm going to use that access to elevate his story. People with large social media platforms can do the same thing. People with multimedia experience, they can tell stories in a visual way. Maybe you have excess funds that you can use to help these organizations kind of get that capital that they need to fight economic and political battles. And so that's what I would suggest.
So where do you see the future of the prison abolition movement?
Oh, God. I mean, I what I'm hoping is that the prison abolition movement has been a story of playing catch up. You know, the system has evolved. It looks different. It's maybe not as overtly racist, but it still has grave racial undertones. And I think that's becoming, the idea that it's not working is becoming more mainstream. So I hope that the next iteration of that is that the movement doesn't have to play catch up anymore. That at some point, it'll develop a strategy that takes into account all the evolutions of the past and prevents them in the future. To me, that looks like not that. To me, that looks like no carve outs, right? I mean, what's allowing California to employ firefighters for $1 an hour out of prison is is the loophole in the 13th Amendment, the exemption that allows them to be treated as slaves because they committed a crime. So today, that looks like when you call for people to be released, you don't say nonviolent versus violent, right? Like, we're looking, first of all, those definitions I think are very misunderstood. And second, that sort of carve out, while like I think appeases voters to an extent, if you really research it and explain it and look at it, that kind of carve out will only allow, again, another iteration. It'll make harder to abolish it completely if you just keep putting, except for these guys, except for these guys, except for these guys. So that's what I'm hoping, is that they find a way forward that takes into account evolutions of the past, and that they can get ahead of it.
So I love to ask my guests this question. What do you want your legacy to be?
Oh God, I don't know. I wanted to be, I want to be a storyteller that caused people to think differently. I don't know. One of my favorite writer, to be honest, is Hunter S. Thompson, and the way that he just basically like threw up on on a page, and then and it like, but it made your mind like think like, yeah, you're right. The people at in Las Vegas, they are acting like animals. Like, yeah, you're right. Um, I think that that's what I want to do. I want to tell stories that take people into places where they might not have otherwise have access, and open their eyes to new possibilities and new ways of thinking.
So what upcoming projects are you working on?
So I am writing a second book. Um, it is very early stages, so but I am going to be, reimagining the revolution started as a digital journey. So I'm doing a number of interviews and profiles that are online. If you go to reimaginingtherevolution.com, there's a blog that's been started. And the big project is Scotty's vision. So the artist that is still incarcerated is Scott Smith, and he's wildly talented. This is his over there.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, yeah. And this portfolio is like all the stuff that I refuse to give away. So, um, but I have opened a store for Scott, and so one of the things is, you know, I want people to, as a journalist, I felt weird about payment in a monetary form. It was more about like amplification, but as an incarcerated artist, Scotty, that doesn't help him. So what I've done with his permission is I've opened a store of his artwork. And you can get prints, you can get bookmarks, you can get originals, you can get commission pieces, and all of the proceeds fund Scotty and his, so he can get tools to create more art. Um, and so if you go to reimaginingtherevolution.com and you visit Scotty's vision, you'll see all of Scotty's amazing artwork. Not all of it, but a good swath of it. And you can purchase a piece for yourself.
So where can people find your book, Reimagining a Revolution, and connect with you on social media?
Reimagining the Revolution is available in most stores, Amazon, Bookshop, Barnes and Noble. It's published by North Atlantic Books. Excuse me. It's published by North Atlantic Books and distributed by Penguin Random House, so it's available in most places. Social media, you can find me on Instagram and Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Reimagining the Revolution. And I just joined Blue Sky, it's at RTR on Blue. And all that information, if it's too much, just go to reimaginingtherevolution.com and you'll get links to everything.
Well, Paula, thank you so much for tackling this very difficult issue and talking about topics that we don't often think about, but it's really important for us to look at as we try to solve some of the internal problems in our country that we just don't often think about. And also making the stories more human so we can see that there's not just situations, but there are actually people impacted by some of the policies that we make.
Yeah. I think that when you tell a story of another person, it's easy to relate to, because I think people forget we have a lot more in common than we have in uncommon.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Paula. Blessings on your work.
All right. Thank you so much, Keith. Thanks for having me.
Do you know that most entrepreneurs hit a revenue ceiling and have no idea why? They're working harder, spending more money, running more ads, but revenue stays flat. My friend Dr. Noah St. John calls this the invisible break. He's giving our listeners a free revenue ceiling audit to help you see what's really holding you back. You'll get a free 30-day membership to NoahBot, giving you access to Dr. Noah's 30 years of experience to help you reach your next level. But hurry, because there's only 50 available this month. So if you're tired of being stuck at the same revenue level and want to finally break through, get your free revenue ceiling audit at drnoahvault.com in the affiliate link that'll be listed in the show notes.